In this second session on orogenic gold deposits, I would like to take our ore deposits knowledge a step further and introduce a number of important Greenstone Belt districts that are currently the focus of exploration and mining. And I will talk about West African Greenstone Belts and then predominantly on Finnish Greenstone Belts, for which we have great data sets, which I will use later on to explain a lot more how exploration techniques can be used to investigate these belts and deposits. West African Greenstone Belts are omnipresent in countries such as Ivory Coast, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Burkina Faso, and Ghana. In fact, the Gold Coast in Ghana has been the location for gold mining for many decades, and many established mine sites can be found there. The key to the gold deposits in West Africa is the geological development during the Archean and predominantly Proterozoic geological time frame. You will see that there is a nucleus of Archean basement core in largely Sierra Leone and partly Liberia. There are a number of Archean greenstone belts present. I've been down there in Sierra Leone. I've investigated some of these greenstone belts. But compared to the Birimian greenstone belts in surrounding countries, there have not been too many discoveries made in Sierra Leone. So the regional geology of West Africa, if I summarize it in a nutshell, you've got, as I said, both Archean and Proterozoic age rocks, and largely we can see a protracted development of orogenic belts that have experienced little or no major deformation or metamorphism for the last 1.5 billion years. And that essentially preserved these Archean and Proterozoic belts and, of course, the gold mineralization. The predominant mines and deposits are situated in the so-called Birimian volcanoclastic assemblages. They are forming a series of volcanic belts. They're usually tens of kilometers wide and several hundred kilometers long. Just take a look at Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso. These greenstone belts are situated within older granitic, gneissic, largely Archean basement rocks. The greenstone belts are largely the interest of exploration and mining. As we've seen in our previous lecture, such greenstone belts are usually characterized by mafic volcanic and sedimentary rocks and steeply dipping subvertical regional fold zones or shear zones, and those form exploration targets. Now, this is a very, very regional map, but for example, if I zoom into a more complex map of Burkina Faso, you can get an idea how sandwiched these greenstone belts are in between older granitic or gneissic basement rocks, and also you can see the relevance of these intrusions that form alongside or inside these greenstone belts. Remember the three major controls in orogenic gold formation. We need a regional green schist metamorphism. It's overprinting the sedimentary and volcanic rocks. We need structural controls such as shear zones, antiforms, and synforms that allow the migration of hydrothermal fluids and provide trap structures. And we need lithological controls, specific lithologies such as mafic volcanics or graphitic schists that are essentially robbing the iron of the transporting fluid and iron complexes, remove the gold and precipitate the gold. We also need intrusions that can be syn to post-orogenic suites that provide a heating source that drives regional fluid flow, and also, of course, a competency contrast between the granite rocks and the surrounding greenstone belts. And all of this is present on this map here. So you can clearly see the presence of greenstone belts, structures, and intrusions that is of key relevance to finding gold deposits in these belts. If I give you an example of greenstone belts in Sierra Leone in the Archean domain, I mentioned before that I worked in some of these greenstone belts, so I would like to share you a couple of examples of figures to show you what you can expect working in greenstone belts in West Africa. Well, first of all, and we will see this photo later on, this entire area is completely covered by vegetation. There is hardly any outcrop. It's very difficult to properly see rocks and understand the geology unless you have good quality geochemistry and geophysics, which can look through the overburden and the weathered laterite. There's also, of course, plenty of artisanal gold mining going on. The locals know there is gold. They have their spots and they extract gold using simplistic sluices and pumps. And as an exploration geologist, it's always good to go and familiarize with these sites, as it's a possibility to understand how the gold occurs, how the overburden looks like. And for example, here you can see the overburden is at least 10 to 15 meters thick. So any geochemical technique needs to be aware, needs to make use of this knowledge of how the regolith is actually looking like and what is it composed of. Okay, is it residual? Has it been moved? That all needs to be understood. I've also been to a few chemical labs in Sierra Leone, and this particular lab here has chemicals stored in a dark room. It's only light because of the flash of my camera. It looks quite unsafe, I have to say, and you need to be able to locate a properly working lab if you do exploration in this part of the world. Often it means that you have to send your samples overseas, where laboratories are operating with known standards and are accredited according to certain international lab standards. What I have to show you as well is some of the curiosities you find during exploration in Africa. I came across this place in Freetown, Sierra Leone. No, it's not in Germany, as you may gather. It's actually in Sierra Leone. I wasn't exactly sure where and how this camp was named, but yes, sometimes as an exploration geologist, you see the oddest things across the world. Anyway, let's move on to these greenstone belts in Sierra Leone. And interestingly, I was involved with a project in the Archean domain, and that company I was involved with operated there for about 10 years. They had a geochemical data set across this area, but never properly looked at it. And since there is actually a drive to explore undercover, you've seen everything is in jungle, everything is forested and vegetated. You need to develop techniques to be able to use geochemistry or geophysics to explain the bedrock geology and therefore formulate your exploration targets. And I used multi-element geochemistry here to produce a bedrock map. So a map that contains the chemical signatures of bedrock types in this area. This is a technique I will talk about later on in more detail, but I just at this stage want to let you know that despite the tropical cover and overburden, I managed to find and trace the different domains in this area. and that could be the mafic volcanics of Greenstone belts, you can see in green color. And I also delineated the granitic gneissic basement, as well as, very curiously, one sample contained a signature that's very, very typical for LCT pegmatites in the central part of the central domain here. I was very curious because I knew that in greenstone belts you can expect LCT pegmatites, so pegmatites that are prospective for lithium, cesium, and tantalum. And long story short, I convinced this company to produce a couple of trenches, and indeed a beautiful spodumene pegmatite was uncovered at this location. So this shows the value of geochemical data, multi-element, trace element geochemical data in regional exploration. I've also used a geochemical dataset to produce a pseudo-radiometric map. Usually you get such a radiometric map using the potassium, thorium, uranium channels from airborne geophysics, and it's usually recorded when you fly a magnetic survey. However, I used the geochemistry of the soil survey here to produce that map, and I could identify in an RGB image, again, the different domains that can be seen within this area. So the different bedrock units at large scale. For example, we can clearly see thorium-rich fractionated granites and gneisses from the basement versus typical mafic and metasedimentary greenstone belt signatures that are really influenced by potassium and uranium signatures that forms that red bluish colors in this image. Moving on, let's quickly talk about Finnish greenstone belts, as we will need this knowledge later on for the exploration case studies that I'm showing you. Greenstone belts in Finland are very common, as the Fennoscandian shield geology is literally Archean Proterozoic geology, bedrock geology. One very interesting product that the Finnish Geological Survey has produced is a peak metamorphic facies map. And you can see on the right-hand side that green schist to lower amphibolite metamorphic facies is mapped out largely here in the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt, the Kuusamo schist belt, the Perapoja schist belt, the Kumo schist belt, the Ilomantsi schist belt, and I could go on forever. The point, however, is that your gold deposits are largely located only where you have these greenstone belts. Now, knowing this fact, and we know it from before because it's one of the key and principal defining factors for orogenic gold deposits, this makes very much sense. So if you have the luxury of obtaining a map that's showing the peak metamorphic facies in your area, you can quickly identify where you have these greenstone belts and the regional geological units that you need to look for when you're exploring for orogenic gold deposits. We've got a map here of the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt in the north. You can see here the overall regional geology, the structures, and the mineral occurrences or projects that have been found over the last 10 to 15 years. To summarize, the majority of the gold deposits can be found indeed along what's called the SSZ, the Circa Shear Zone, which is stretching and extending from the west all along to the southeastern part of the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt, and there's an extension to the north here called the Nolpio thrust fold. This thrust fold is an earlier stage deformational phase where you had the collision of two cratons. You can see that basically there's a thrust happening between the later stage metasiliciclastic rocks of the Kumpu group. Those are conglomerates. And you've got the tholeiites of the Kittilä Formation. Those are mafic volcanics. So again, you see we've got the lithological features here, the tholeiites, we've got metaconglomerates, we've got structural control here along the D2 reactivated thrusts, and you can also observe bends and jogs within this fault zone here. And of course, this enables the introduction of later stage deformational events and fault zones. And this is exactly where we can find a number of recent gold showings that have been outlined previously. But not only that the D2 fault zone is of importance, we also have the northeast southwest trending D3 shear zones, and they can be found all across the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt. You can follow my cursor here. Those D3 deformational zones are younger deformational zones. You can see that the northeast southwestern trends, they are rotating towards northwest southeasterly trending structures. That's because that eastern bulge of the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt has been rotated during these deformational phases. The only producing mine at the moment, the Kittilä mine, is situated along such a D3 fault zone. So all along the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt, we've got different deformational phases, different deformational events that led to the location and occurrence of gold deposits. And that is very important to understand. Okay, so we've got multiple targets here, and also very interestingly, the kind of gold deposits, the mineralogical and geochemical association varies between the D3 deposits here in the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt proper. They are usually gold arsenic dominated, whilst the deposits here along the Circa shear zones are usually characterized by gold, arsenic, copper, nickel, uranium occurrences. And that is largely because the host rocks are not only tholeiitic basalts, but also down here, graphitic schists of the Savukoski group. Right? These graphite and sulfide bearing schists, they are of course also a trap, redox and geochemical trap to copper, uranium, and all other base metals that then form part of an orogenic gold deposits and are picked up by the auriferous fluids that are going through and placed in this domain. So we need to be aware of the typical orogenic signature in the Kittilä Formation and the atypical geochemical signature with nickel, copper, and uranium in the southern part in the Savukoski Formation. Moving on, I would like to give you a couple of examples of deposits that are found there. I mentioned the Kittilä mine, which is currently operational, but there are also other historic mines that are still present but not operated at the moment. For example, the Satopora mine along the Circa shear zone that we've just seen. This is a mine that usually and first was recognized as a copper deposit, and people were mining the copper that has been formed in these graphitic schists. Only since they analyzed the rocks for gold did they realize actually there is also a gold occurrence there that is much more prospective. So this Satopora mine site has been mined in the 1980s, and it has then stopped, and it's currently just been rehabilitated. You can see I took this photo on a waste dump, and you can see the tailing dams in front of the waste dump. The open pit mines are a bit to the right. You cannot properly see it here, but it's just to illustrate that there are known gold deposits in the CLGB the CLGB is currently overstaked because people have recognized the importance of the CLGB and as a result run to get licenses there. That asks, of course, for other areas in the region where you can explore for gold deposits if everything is staked and licensed in the CLGB. And I mentioned earlier, just a continuation to the north in the Karasjok and the Kautokeino Greenstone belts in Norway is the next exploration frontier. So what can we see in terms of the typical controls of the Finnish Greenstone belts and the gold deposits there? Well, we know already that the structural control is the primary target indicator. We have identified in the geological map key thrust and shear zones along the Circa zones, the Hanima shear zone, the Musa shear zone. They are all D2 and D3 structural events along which we can find gold deposits. We can find typical orogenic gold alteration signatures such as albite, K-feldspar, sericite, anchorite alteration. And we have the typical and atypical gold mineralization and geochemical signatures that I've been talking about. Again, understanding the vein paragenesis, and as I mentioned in my first lecture and video, understanding how these veins actually represent different deformational phases is key in establishing which vein paragenesis are carrying mineralization. And one example is here at Satopora. This is a photo I've taken on the waste dump. And you can clearly see here is a strongly altered metabasalt, a tholeite, that contains numerous directions of veins that have been filled with anchorite and with other alteration minerals. Now figuring out which of these vein directions actually carries the gold mineralization is what we as geologists need to figure out. And of course you can see some small grains of gold in some of these veins, and that's always, of course, what we as exploration geologists want to see. What we need to pay attention to as well is in the Northern Hemisphere, whether it's Finland, Norway, or Canada, we have the influence of glacial till and other quaternary cover, which is really having a severe impact on the soils and the cover of the bedrock. So understanding glacial movements and till is important when you deal with geochemical samples of till, but this is a topic we're going to talk about in detail in the next lecture. So just to summarize, in this session here, we've learned about different greenstone belts in West Africa and Finland. We saw how typical controls on gold mineralization, such as structural control, metamorphism control, lithological control, all are very similar. And if we know how these structural controls work, we'll be able to understand and explore for orogenic gold deposits. In the next video, I will show you the exploration techniques that are commonly used for these gold deposits, and I will link back examples from across the world, but I will particularly focus on the Central Lapland Greenstone Belt, as there is very good public domain data available that can be used to illustrate the exploration in this terrain. Thank you for tuning in.